Yeah.
You know,
Whoa, on a roll. You have anything there, Mr. Mike? Nope. Okay. Move to adopt, or?
is that a motion to accept the minutes as presented?
Mhm.
Okay. So Michael, Gary? Get,
Yeah.
we have too many mics. Yep. Is there a second?
I will second.
Ooh, attention there.
From Michael McHugh, second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes are approved. We have no public hearings scheduled. Old business is the draft housing implementation plan. So, Mike
And there's two
Roth.
separate.
Mr. Ross.
See, I'm just Mike.
Yeah, Mike.
Two separate items included in your packet. First is a two-page summary of the Housing Solutions Workshop that was held on September 4th. It was a nice turnout, and I thought good conversation, and a whole heck of a lot of information to try to digest in a pretty short period of time for some of those folks. But we did get,
It was a good group.
yeah, well, it turned out to be a real good group. And I think we got some good results out of it. So this is, if you have anything you want to talk about in this meeting summary, we can do that right now. Otherwise, they're just trying to record it.
I have some notes that I took, but my question is, if in the second part is there all the recommendations. So I mean, a lot
Yeah.
of times, I don't know if it makes sense. On page 1, it said number 6, consider extension of city utilities proactively rather than waiting for developmental proposals. Is that real? Is the city considering?
No,
Okay,
but somebody did talk about it at the meeting.
of course.
So that's what it's trying to represent here, is that was brought up at the meeting.
Okay.
I would never recommend that,
No.
just based on the cost. I think there's more cost-effective ways for us to get at this, but there were a lot of folks in the room that thought it was a good idea, particularly people who build houses for a living, and they recognize that that is one of the major factors in whether there's going to be a house built there.
And there
or
was
not.
quite a bit of discussion about, like, if we zone this or that because of potential or planned extension of utilities or whatnot, but
Yeah.
are you just saying it's just,
I think 15 years ago, we still thought about things that way, like where are we going to put more utilities in the future? And there's just no financially responsible way to make plans like that right now. There's too many reasons why there aren't utilities where there aren't, whether it's wetlands or rock or whatever the cost
those would be,
factors
yeah,
are.
I mean, those would be logical reasons, but
And
I
those
mean, are there
reasons all
other
existed.
areas?
They existed in a lot of these neighborhoods too. There just weren't rules about it, or there wasn't as much cost associated with dealing with it.
I think the last time we looked at it really in earnest was probably going out west of 8th Avenue and 4th Street, looking in that area, and the wetland issues are fairly significant, and with the wetland regulations, it just didn't seem that there was a way to make that that type of an investment without any assurances that there could be.
And is that for both septic, I mean, for electric and sewage, or is it, I mean, like, is it
It's-
possible you could run electric but not sewage?
Yeah, we can put electric out fairly easily.
Because there were some other conversations of like rezoning, like maybe this area, if at least they have electricity, they can still do septic systems and they can, I mean, is there any plan about extending electricity that way?
I think in
We're much
terms of
more
septic.
interested in not proactively like they're using that word. I guess it's not the way I would use that word, but not in front of development proposals.
Okay.
We don't generally extend electric either, but it's a lot cheaper to extend electric. So a developer's not going to have that be a barrier to getting their project done. Even if we're 1,000 feet away from them with electricity, we can get there for dollars per foot rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars when we're talking about water and sewer lines. And those types of utilities, they have some exemptions, pipelines and wires when you go through wetlands. but you don't get those exemptions for streets. And streets are the big space hogs, and then, of course, building sites as well.
Okay.
And when you're talking about putting in municipal utilities, you want dense sites, you want a lot of sites connected to that investment. And so when you're looking at a block that's entirely wetland, it just seems like a lot of barriers between here and streets and utilities and houses getting built.
We see that on, you know, the area, like in Creechville, where we did extend utilities, and there's still quite a bit of the land in Creechville that potentially would have access to utility, sewer and water utilities, but is really not suited for development because of the wetland issues.
Yep.
And it's kind of what we talked about when we talked about extending utilities out on 4th Street west of 8th Avenue West, that beyond there, the wetland issues become much more significant. And, you know, I mean, if we had an area that could be developed with higher density.
That's ultimately, I guess, the question that I'm trying to get to it. Are there identified areas, like, you know, we could maybe really take advantage of this? And one other thing that I was wondering, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but if I may, I just was on page 3 of the Housing Regulations Implementation Plan, and they were kind of like giving us their recommendations. Number 8 was the idea of completed review of the zoning map to align, et cetera. And I'm apologizing if I'm wasting your time, but is there any vacant land that could be annexed? Like, maybe the city could annex this area and we could develop it in that sense. Is that been identified? Or if you look at the city limits, there's some wacky configurations and kind of like, well, how comes that not, and how come this is, and is that a discussion?
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversations in 20 years about what if we extended here and annexed that piece of property or this, and it's generally not in a vacuum. Usually the landowner is involved in that conversation, and none of that's really panned out.
Okay.
And I don't think that's likely to be the low-hanging fruit either.
Okay.
Because it means we have to build more sewer utilities, and probably a length of it, which is very expensive.
Okay.
So there's a piece of property that's about 100 acres just west of city limits that's vacant for the most part right now. And if you're talking about that kind of development, if
maybe
I have to spend $1 million in water and sewer just to get to my front door, but I've got 100 acres, which means I could build 300 houses, then maybe 300 houses can absorb that $1 million up front. But just think about that scale. We've got 650 houses in town.
Got it.
So, that kind of a project seems pretty far-fetched.
Okay.
When we're doing 6 to 8 houses in a super busy year of building permits, and some years we have 0. To think about that kind of scale is pretty hard. So to get it back down to that 6 to 8 house kind of project, we probably don't have anything that we need to annex to make that happen. I think there are some places we could target that are in the city limits.
Okay.
That are close to utilities.
Yeah.
To look at that scale of project. But really, we don't necessarily have to be the ones doing it either. There are developers out there that are starting to push on some of those things.
Then as far as the meeting notes, the summary, I have no further questions.
I mean, the one thing that came out, at least insofar as trying to make it easier for builders to build, but I thought there might be some way of helping, was to see if there was some way we could, I don't know, make it a little cheaper somehow. Not that they would not pay it all up front, or that they would pay for it eventually, but maybe not all up front, or something like that, and working on some method so that we could be encouraging of the development. But again, I just feel like in terms of getting density, we have a lot of other things we could do way easier than that and cheaper. But I get what they were getting at the meeting anyway.
Yeah, I think that's always the challenge with, a development project is, balancing the city's interest to the developer's interest. And, I think unless they come together and mesh pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, we've only seen, I mean, a couple development projects that have even occurred within the city limits in, I don't know, the last 20 years. I mean, Anton's subdivision is one of the first subdivisions we've seen that's actually gonna be on city sewer and water. That's a pretty rare thing, so.
Yeah, Senti Sites before that,
Yeah.
Humphrey Circle before that. It's pretty rare.
So there just isn't much of that going on, and
Yeah.
and the developers, I think, are trying to figure out ways to utilize some of the spaces that are available and could be readily accessed with utilities. And I mean, one of the areas that's been talked about is that kind of that area in the horseshoe of the Gunflint Trail. Is that potentially an area? It's adjacent to Creechville, which has sewer and water service to it.
Oh, so do you mean on the east
Inside of the
side?
turn, yeah.
Oh,
The city owns that property.
Yeah.
Was that a water, were you referring to that when you were saying that there's some, water issues there, or?
I'm
think
not aware of any,
anybody's
not aware of any significant water issues. I mean, wetland issues.
Got it,
and
wetland,
that. I mean,
that's what I meant.
there might be some wetlands in there, but I don't think there's, not to the extent that the Fourth Street area, west of Eighth, I mean, that is almost exclusively wetlands as you go in that direction. But when you say, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why you don't see developers or investors coming in to do things like build apartment buildings or create housing projects, is there's not a lot of financial incentive for them to do it. I mean, not necessarily because of the city, but just because of tax regulations and return on investment and that kind of thing. There's a lot of risk involved, and,
Yeah.
risk to return, and,
Yeah.
you say, well, I think I'll look for something else to do with my money.
Yeah.
Other than Anton, I don't know anybody who's been building houses on speculation in town for a long time, maybe ever. I don't know the last time somebody was building them and putting them for sale.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
there's a pretty steady market. If a lot becomes available in town and it's for sale, it's gonna get a house built on it these days.
But not necessarily maybe affordable housing. I mean,
Definitely
I mean,
not.
that seemed to
Yeah.
be the
Yeah.
theme of the meeting. There's an overwhelming need for affordable housing.
That's an excellent segue to the housing regulations implementation plan. And I think it's worth skipping ahead to the bottom half of page 1, where we've identified 4 key housing issues. And the first one being the development of more affordable housing for year-round residents and workers, and even seasonal residents and workers, but affordable being one of the tricky challenges.
Yeah.
The next one, development of more multifamily housing, and I think that's potentially related to the first one pretty strongly. Development of senior housing, that's one that we've, as a community, probably spent more time talking about in the past 10 years than any of these other ones, but not with a lot of results to show for it. And then cost-efficient housing development that maximizes use of existing city utilities before requiring extension. So that's kind of the answer to, are we really thinking about extending? If it's cost-efficient, but we think there's a lot of opportunities to use what we've got first.
Yeah.
So that's the 4 issues that their recommendations are based on. And then their implementation plan is listing these in priority order, and I think it's worth talking about, is this your priority order or not? Because at some point, it'd be
Yeah.
nice to have this adopted and it be the plan, and we start chipping away at these things.
I gotcha.
So let's just make sure we all understand what the heck these things are first.
Okay.
Number 1 is the current housing types that are allowed in the zoning ordinance is limited to just 4, and they list what those are. And their suggestion is to make a change to our zoning ordinance, basically, that has a broader range of housing types, including smaller lot, single-family houses, accessory dwelling units, corner houses, courtyard, a list of things, and they
Yeah.
showed what those things are, and we have that information available for people to look at if they want to know what they mean by any of these terms. So if we're going to pick this as priority number one, I think one of the reasons is it's fairly easy for us to do. It's just a regulatory change. And so we would start looking at some draft zoning language that allows different uses and have some conversations with the community about what that might mean and get some feedback. I don't want to downplay that it's super easy to do. It's going to affect everybody because we're talking about changing all of the residential zones. in
But from
terms of
what
what's
everything
allowed.
we've said so far, this seems to be a logical solution.
I think that it allows you a lot of more options for providing affordable or multifamily or any of these other uses. So that,
Yeah.
I mean, just the picture of what the outcome you're looking for is more housing units in our existing neighborhoods.
Right.
So
Or like
some
a
people
greater
are not going to like
density.
that idea very much. That's going to be, there's an assumption that this neighborhood that I live in is what it's supposed to be, and from here out and throughout time, it shall never change, because that's what I want it to be. That's in direct conflict with what's the most cost-efficient way for us to add additional housing units in town. And so that's a conversation that has to happen. If we're going to have that, we're going to change the zoning rules. That's the biggest dynamic, I think, that we're going to have to work through as a community.
You know, I think back to, historically in the city, in the areas that were developed early on and the types of homes that were built. And as you look kind of through the history of the city, you see some of the areas that were first developed, and that area is just right above the highway, back behind the North Shore building between Broadway and First Avenue West, where you have houses, small houses on small lots, but there's some, I would say, modest-sized houses too, but, you have a use of the alley where there's homes or cabins on the alley that, it's probably the highest density of development that we see in the city. To me, it doesn't change the character of the community, but it's certainly far different than what you see going, say, west of 8th Avenue West, where every home has a large lot, and, and you can't really, those things aren't gonna change because those lots are all platted, that's what they're set aside as, and
But
are you
then
gonna
we
try to
could-
squeeze homes in between those homes?
Or you could add some of those accessory dwelling units, perhaps. I mean, if we
Yeah.
make some of those zoning changes, so.
Yes, but my point is that, over in this part of town, you saw that kind of happening kind of as the community developed, because that's kind of what the needs were. And it seemed like when the zoning regulations came into effect in the early 70s, that all of a sudden things went to a larger sized lot. Before that, people could buy 1 or 2 or 3 lots or 4 lots or half a block and, kind of decide what size lot they wanted and how much, they could afford to spend on the property, because now the cost of just buying a lot is so cost prohibitive. I mean, you can't buy a buildable lot in town for, I think it's $80,000 is what it's gonna take to buy a buildable lot, and, unless it's something that's grandfathered in, it's smaller, but even that, it's not gonna be significantly less than that. So those are certainly obstacles to creating affordable housing when you start out with a lot that's $80,000.
Well, hence why we will probably talk about changing, there's some of the other recommendations about minimal sizes and whatnot, so. But I would agree that number one still is number one. If the original question is if we look at this list of 1, 2, 3, 4, and is this the actual priority, I would still think number one is number one.
Number 2 on their list is really strongly related to number 1 in my
Yeah,
mind. As a matter of fact, I'm
so-
not sure that it's a separate issue.
No, because you can't get the one without the other, I
Yeah.
don't think.
Well, they're talking about small lot in number 1, and then they have dimensional standards in number 2. And I think, I would guess the majority of our zoning, of our variances that we've dealt with that are either setback or dimensional variances. And I don't remember saying no to one for, a long time. I think the city has been saying yes. Maybe that's just because people have been reasonable in what they're asking, or maybe it's because the dimensional requirements aren't sacrosanct and maybe they're not even as important as we think they are. And so this is an interesting thought to say, okay, what if minimums were smaller, the widths were smaller, the depths were smaller, just as a starter. And the background of that conversation, again, is just the data collection we've done about what lot sizes are out there. And there's a lot of lots that are not 10,000 square feet or 75 feet in width right now. There's also quite a few that are a lot bigger than that, meaning that if our dimensional requirements are smaller, then a bigger lot is potentially 2 full lots rather than just a bigger lot. It doesn't have to be, we're not forcing someone to do that, but we're allowing the community that
Flexibility.
opportunity. And so, right now, if somebody wanted to do that, we'd invite the neighbors and ask them each and every time. What change like this would mean is we're going to have that conversation once as a community, and then it's going to be allowed, and we're not going to ask the neighbors each and every time. So it's a big change, but if we're talking about a barrier to getting more housing, the idea that I need to ask for a variance in order to build on this is definitely a barrier.
I also think, I'll refer back to, the Marais community goals, and this kind of connects with what you were saying. This idea of infrastructure that's aesthetically pleasing, enhances Marais' historic character. So when you talk about some of these cute historic neighborhoods where you got these little cottages on small, I think that's important to everybody to maintain that quaintness or something, I guess, if that's.
I think it's a level of diversity that, not everything is cookie cutter, zoning ordinance almost creates that because you require a certain minimum lot size and everybody has to have that. The zoning ordinance was developed in the 70s when a lot of suburban development was going on. And I think they took on a lot of the characteristics that suburbia was going through.
Heating or fuel is cheaper. You could.
Everybody wanted a large lot with, and build a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house and, enough room to have a backyard and a front yard and, a lawn and maybe that's not the model that we're looking at. In fact, I would say it's not the model that we're looking at anymore. I think we've diverted from that model.
Yeah.
So I think that conversation happens at the same time. And so how might we implement 1 and 2? We might give our friends at HKGI a call again and say, let's do this. Let's have a conversation about what these zoning rules look like, and let's have some interaction with the community about the effects of that and get some input, and then look at some draft ordinances. So that's a project that we could potentially take on in 2020, or even at the end of this year and go through the winter with.
Yeah.
Number 3, new housing types may require unique zoning standards and development procedures. Well, now perhaps that's also part of that conversation, but slightly further down the road. And when you look at that list again in 1, and think back to the images that Jeff showed us about what some of these things look like, the idea is to try and create density with it still looking similar to the types of buildings that were there before. And so some of these are a lot more building than there used to be allowed on the property, but it still is, there are features of it that keep it at a scale with the rest of the construction around there. So whether it's a courtyard with a U-shaped building around it that's got multiple units in it, but it's keeping it low and relatively small. Everybody's got their own front door, those sorts of things. That's where they're saying, okay, if we're willing to take that on, the chance that my neighbor's 10,000 square foot lot that used to have 1 house is going to have 4 units on it now, or 6 units on it, or whatever I don't know.
Cottage design or whatever.
Whatever it looks like. What are the characteristics that we might want to require that we're confident are going to work, that we write into the code? And I think the further we go from where we're at today, the more we're going to have to be cautious about what are those rules that we want to add. rather than just say, okay, it's a free-for-all, everybody can have 2 accessory dwelling units, ready, go. That might be fun too. We'd certainly get results. We'd get a lot more housing units and a lot of them would be affordable. But it would be a lot of fast change that would be difficult for some folks.
If what happened, I missed the first part of that.
Accessory dwelling units are allowed, everybody can have 2, ready,
Yeah.
go.
Okay.
And, you know, most people wouldn't do anything, but a lot of people would build 2. And then the character could potentially change in somebody's neighborhood. It certainly would change, at least in an individual perspective. So, do we want to limit that? That's kind of this idea of number 3 is,
Yeah.
do we want to put some rules in place about some of those really different housing types that we just don't have right now, or not? And that's worth a conversation, I think.
Yeah, I just don't know when we started, I mean, I guess we'd have to really look at it, but it seems to me when we've started to wade into those types of things, I mean, even when we've talked about downtown, we've ended up where it's like, you know, I don't like it, but so-and-so likes it, and like, how do we make a rule? Which is the problem. I don't know that we could make a rule that we're gonna like.
No. Well, if you think about where our historic character came from, it came from a no rule situation.
Right,
That's where most of our housing was built, with no rules.
right.
And I think we like it. There's some things we don't like about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work, but we accept it.
And I think historically, I mean, you know, it's, you walk these neighborhoods, you see these, what, there used to be little cabins in people's backyards. I mean, there was that element of it, you know, I don't know, I always thought that was part of the charm, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and I can see things like, well, I know I'm getting off, but I was just thinking like, yeah, I mean, I can see like maybe height requirements and things like that, but they're gonna be pretty general rules, and I think the people who are not gonna be happy are still not gonna be happy.
You're probably
That's
right.
right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I try to think of an actual situation with our neighbor, for instance, where that's been a single-family home and a duplex and back and forth, and who the heck can even tell, right?
Right,
So, and it's just, you know, there are a lot of duplexes in town that I think unless you know it's a duplex, you can't just look at it and see that. There's even some triplexes that are that way. So,
yeah,
the risk is the market will demand some of these things. And where I was gonna have a small, single-family home that's now a duplex because I converted it, maybe somebody will build a new one. If we allow a 4-unit building, somebody's gonna build one because they'll have customers that'll buy that housing.
yeah.
And that could have a lot more potential to look different than kind of the stuff that's just popped up randomly before.
Yeah.
Well, and even when you talk about duplexes, I mean, you think typically duplexes in Grand Marais have been rental properties where could it be that the duplexes are individually owned and separated?
Mm.
And that's a case where I think we have a lot of vested interest in having some rules. And
Mhm.
that same idea with all the single cabins that are out there, these cute little, I mean, they'd be great starter home, like really small, but the price is gonna be right if there's enough of them. If they're all connected to the same sewer line though, we don't wanna be left having to deal with that. That we already have that situation in a few places and it's just a nightmare for everybody.
Mhm.
So if there's gonna be an ability to
You mean if
create
they're all tied into
small
the same-
lots
yeah.
that are separately owned,
Mhm.
one of the rules I would recommend is that they have their own individual utility situations, or they have some mechanism in place that manages that.
Well, I think about it with all of these kind of concepts, these new concepts, is that I mean, there has to be a buy-in by the community. I don't think that, you know, we as the planning commission or the city can create rules that are gonna be accepted if it's not something that's favored and brought forth as with a strong backing within the community. All we're gonna do is be seeing these things running up against, you know, opposition from neighbors and, you know, creating all this conflict. And, I mean, that never ends well. So unless you have,
I don't know if it never does, you know,
Well,
we've
yeah.
made a lot of changes that seemed like that to me, that I think have worked out. I think another way to look at it is, we've already heard from the community,
Mhm.
and they said housing's important, and they said affordable housing is a dire need, and they said more housing is what we want. And now if we come up with some ways to do that, and there's resistance to it, we've got to decide, was it more important what we already heard, or is this resistance more important? And you can really look at it from both directions. You can say, we have to do this because this is what the community has demanded already.
Well, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'm saying that the ultimate decision comes with community, buying into it and.
We
you
can
know,
only expect to
suggesting.
have so much buy.
Well, yeah, I don't think you have universal support necessarily,
Right.
but.
You would certainly hope, but I
but
mean,
the
I
people-
think everybody recognizes, that, I mean, it's a prevalent need. One question I have is, you've been talking about like starter homes and stuff and versus rent, like, is not affordable housing also rentals?
Sure.
I mean,
Absolutely.
just affordable rental property
Yep.
Yeah.
is I mean, and that was expressed again and again in our workshop in September. Okay, I just want to verify that.
And I feel like this number one, the list in number one is really agnostic as to whether you're owning or renting.
Great.
And just
Yeah.
more options.
Just
It's going to be more owning
having
and
some
more renting.
affordable options, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, number four, now this is one that they brought to us really more than I think we as a community said, we really think we should do this. But that's why we hired somebody with some outside perspective to say, hey, this works for some communities, so you can think about whether it would work for you too. Mobile home, manufactured home. Now, there's some areas in our ordinance that they're just suggesting we change because they're hard to understand or they don't work very well. But I think there also was at least it seemed to me that Jeff was suggesting, this is potentially a way for you to add more affordable housing. If you make this barrier go away, that somebody could do more mobile housing.
Yeah, and I think they were talking about differentiating between mobile homes and manufactured homes, and I think if I remember, the zoning recommendations were crazy. Like, it's in the
Well,
sense
mobile
of,
homes, yeah, the
There's really
dimensions
no way
we
to do
put
it.
on a mobile home park
Yeah,
requirements were, I mean, the state already has some rules about that, and I think maybe their suggestion is we don't need to recreate that with our own set of rules.
right.
And then manufactured homes, we don't really do any regulating about that. We do have some language in our zoning ordinance that talks about manufactured homes, but it's not one that you can't have them. It says they have to have a foundation. Well, I mean, come on, everybody's got to
Yeah,
have a foundation.
they will.
And it doesn't even say you have to have like a basement or a concrete foundation, just,
A
it's-
foundation, something
Yeah.
strong.
It's-
Well, I think part of it is the definitions and people's lack of understanding of what a manufactured home is. There's such a stigma, I think, attached to any reference to, I mean, mobile home, manufactured home, it seems to be cast into the same,
Yeah. And it's really not the same thing anymore.
I think that one of the things that we could do is kind of maybe see if we could somehow help remove that stigma by not casting it as kind of a second-class type residence. I mean, tell you, there's a lot of manufactured homes in this community that.
And they have been historically
No,
used to
nobody,
bring them
nobody,
up on the
nobody,
ship.
nobody, well, even in recent years, that, you can't tell, you wouldn't ever know that it's a manufactured home. I mean, I could probably point out at least 10, manufactured homes that don't look any different than a normal stick-built house.
I think the recommendation just to be like, just have very clear language, like, let's just talk about, mobile homes. And,
Yeah.
And just making that the subset.
And maybe
then
we
you can-
don't ever even say manufactured.
Right, that just takes care of that, and that's an easy fix.
Yeah.
Well, I think the one reference in the ordinance is that there's a minimum building width of 17 feet.
Yeah.
Which was specifically put in there to circumvent somebody trying to put in a single-wide mobile home. I could tell you,
Yeah.
that happened. It's there, it's
I
in the
think so.
ordinance. Yeah.
And now we're saying, if somebody wants to bring in a single-wide mobile home, that might be a really cost-efficient way of providing affordable housing, if that's what our issue is. Maybe we don't want that barrier.
Well, even the mobile home park regulations within our ordinance are probably antiquate, well, I'm sure they're antiquated, you know, I mean, the state has regulations that they
Right.
revise and are probably more current than the city's ordinance. You know, I mean, we have a mobile home park out at, you know, Bruce Block's property, former Gopher property, and, I mean, that's the kind of impression people have of when you talk about a mobile home park. I drive through small communities all over the state, and I can tell you almost every small community has a mobile home park or manufactured home park that has attractive-looking homes, yards that are maintained around, but they provide a housing option that we don't have in this community. And, you know, if we're serious about, you know, trying to affect the issue of affordable housing, that should be something that should be on the table.
I'm not sure where I feel about it on the list. 'Cause
Yeah.
I mean, not that I don't think it's a idea worth considering. I'm just not sure that that it's ripe, that there's somebody out there that wants to do this, and that this is actually a barrier to something.
I just want to back up and clarify one thing. The conversation that we're having is we have a list of priorities 1 through 10, and our job right now is to rank. We're going to attack these one by one. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and I just want to, first of all, make sure we're all on the same page, and we understand what this is, but then, is it on the list in the right place is one of the questions, too.
Okay.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Michael.
No. Yeah, I mean, I can see, you know, clarifying the language or just pointing to the state language or something of that sort. But in terms of like rank, again, I do feel like 2 goes to 1. I mean, I think we could contract that into one thing. And I agree, I think like, well, clarifying the language is probably important. I don't know how high up the list I would put that.
Well, let's look below it and see if there's anything you think is more important.
Or just maybe easier to get done with. Like we can just get this one and we're done.
Well, this one is super easy. But are we willing to accept the consequences of that is the question. I mean, if we say the minimum lot area isn't 5,000 square feet anymore, we can probably just figure out from the state what it should be or not have a minimum lot area at all. But then the minimum site area of 5 acres, are you confident that we know where these fit? Or that what the approval process is, where they might go, that, I mean, this is the sort of thing that could definitely change the character of a neighborhood if we said you can have a mobile home park on an acre. Well, there's a city block that might be, you know, that I can think of an existing lot right now that's across from the community center that's more than an acre.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
you know, do you want to see 8 mobile homes there? Maybe, I don't know.
Good point.
But, you know, that's where, maybe it's easy, but it might be worth spending a little time on it still,
Mm-hmm.
just to think it through.
Okay.
Number 5, this is the multifamily, and I really think this one's a key one to work on, and it's this concept of set the rules that you're willing to accept. So a 3-unit building has to fit this set of rules. A 4-unit building has to fit this set of rules. And to however many units you're willing to accept. And then there's not this open question of whether I'm going to get permission or not, because I have to go through a conditional use permit process. That conditional use permit process is 6 to 8 weeks and $200. Neither of those are barriers. The idea that the neighbors get to weigh in and it's a political decision is a huge barrier, because I'm not going to invest a lot of money in buying a piece of property or even getting control of it with a purchase agreement and doing some design work and all that if I've got no idea what the community wants to see there. So if we set these rules up front and say, if you're going to build a 4-unit, it needs this much square footage and it has to have these setbacks.
And then if you set this first, then you can go into number 1. Now you can start. I mean, I get you.
Yeah.
I see the logic in what you're trying to identify. It makes sense to me.
I mean, this is the number 1 conversation all over again for me. we're going to allow courtyard cottage housing. All right, well, under what circumstances? And this is
Yeah,
the under
like
what
how many?
circumstances right here.
Right.
How much?
And this model that we make it permitted rather than conditional is the barrier that's removed that I think makes the difference.
Right on.
Number 6, should we have a rural residential zoning? And this is really more of a reorganization than a new set of rules, because we already have different dimensional requirements if you're not connected to municipal sewer. So this is maybe, the barrier here is it's hard to understand, because it's hard to find where the rules are, and we're just reorganizing them more than we're changing them. But I also think we could add to this that we're not very good at this. We don't have any expertise in septic systems. We don't have any actual deal with the county to do it on our behalf, or with anybody else to do it on our behalf. We rely on a homeowner or a property owner to come to us and say, here's my multiple septic sites, but we don't have great rules to say this is how you have to provide that information to us or what our standards are.
Mhm.
So I think if we're looking for rural development of residential lots, that we've got some work we can do. And I guess I would add that to this. If we're gonna create that district, it's also an opportunity for us to figure out how to make it work better.
So this is something that comes later in life.
If we think that this, taking, 1 or 2 or 3 acre or 5 acre pieces where they don't have municipal sewer, is where we're gonna get more housing, like that's easier than sticking it in the neighborhoods, then this is where we should start. Certainly easier because there aren't any neighbors, so that conversation isn't gonna occur. But in terms of the impact it has, I don't think it's nearly as big. So
Well, I would think that the priority would be, to me, a lot lower, just because I don't really think that this is really that big of an impediment to affordable housing. It's, might be an impediment to somebody building, but I don't think it's an issue of affordability. It's more of an issue of just how do we do this?
And the dimensional requirements haven't been a barrier that I've seen. There's been more subdivisions of this type of lot in the city than other, we talked about there aren't any subdivisions except for just a handful where there's municipal sewer. There's a bunch where there's not. And they're generally bigger lots than we require. So they're not looking to do that as affordable housing. And I don't think, they go back to the housing study that the EDA did 5 years ago, and the idea that I want a 900 square foot house on 5 acres that's within a 10-minute drive to town or walk to town, and that costs less than $150,000. You just start to pile all these requirements on, and it's fantasy land. It doesn't exist. You can't get a piece of property and then put a septic system and a well on it.
Right.
And still be able to build a building and have it be affordable, unless you're sourcing all the materials yourself for free and building it with your own labor. Then maybe you can, but otherwise, that's just not happening. It's certainly not happening at any scale. So it's got to be connected to municipal sewer, I think, for it to have any chance to make a real impact numbers-wise.
Yeah.
Well, and that would, my thought is I think I've known builders, and I've heard some of the conversations of people I think I can still build this for less. I think I can maybe build a home with a septic and a well, and I could do it for $175. I could do it,
I've only heard Anna say that.
Well, I think of Doug Syme, he was really he made that happen for us, Was that completely, but to make it affordable was, we lived out in Hovland, so that's, it was not within the 10 minutes. But,
Yeah.
there are definitely builders, I think, that are out there committed to that. But the point is, they can still do
that.
it.
Yeah, there's not a
Yeah,
barrier.
yeah, there's no barrier. They can still do that. If they think they can do it, they can do it.
Yeah,
And they can
go
get
for
this
it.
property, and they can, just because it's in the city limits, there's no other hangup, is there?
I actually think we have less barriers in the city to do that than you have in the county, because they have effective regulations in
Yeah.
the county, which we don't.
Okay.
And that makes it easier for people to do. Maybe not to the betterment of the community in all
I think
aspects.
that's a little scary.
Yeah.
I
But again,
kinda want a little
the
oversight of
speed
those
that's
septics.
happening somebody subdivides their lot into 5 lots, and there aren't houses on them. They don't get built out. Whereas if you've got that lot in town with sewer that's ready to go, it's getting built on. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
where the action is. Number 7, and this I think is the same idea again. Do we need a rural versus urban zoning? The first zoning map is treating, it's got that big pink R1 swath heading up the hillside in a place that we know is not going to be developed as single-family residential, and certainly not as dense single-family residential. Do we zone it different? I think 6 and 7 are kind of the same thing. Do we have a different set of rules, and if we do, then we'll call it a different thing? We'll have
What
it
do you
be a
do with
different
that
part of
property? I mean, the city owns this property. You can't, you're telling me it doesn't really, people don't really build on it?
Well, we don't own all of it.
Okay.
It's in the city limits. The city and the county do own quite a bit of it. They're talking about a regional park development on it, and I think one of the reasons why it's gone that direction is because of all the barriers to development, or the effects of development on a slope like that above us. But there are also privately owned properties out there, and you think about everybody on County 7, for instance, in the city limits, that's all that same zoning, and most of it's rural, not municipal utilities. And, there's a lot of homes within that first quarter section, that first 1,000 feet even from the road, that just built driveways in and have septic sites. So a lot of wetlands up there, and probably a lot of other barriers to development too. So the stuff that's owned contiguous to County 7 is almost all built out anyway. But then that next 40
Yeah.
that's above that, how do you get to it is really the bigger obstacle.
Well, it's all on the hillside and with the wetland and, stormwater regulations, the drainages coming off the hillside are, significant.
But is that land, again, that I know what you're talking about now, is that owned by the city?
Some is owned by the city, some is owned privately.
Not much.
If it was going to be
It's
developed,
mostly-
the privately is lower too, so it's got a better chance to be developed. But if it was going to be developed, would it be affordable? Probably not, If there's any view opportunity and you've got this isolation and you're right next to the bluff, it seems more likely that it'd be higher end stuff where you'd build on 10 acres yourself. So,
I don't think
again, it's not a
zone-
barrier that we have an issue about there.
Yeah, I don't think zoning has been the impediment to
No.
development. It's just, for a lot of other reasons, it hasn't been developed.
I think the major reason's been that people that have owned it haven't had any need to do anything with it. The family isn't looking to be developers.
Right.
They don't want to sell it yet. They still own it. As generations change, some of that stuff will shake loose and
Mhm.
has already, and we'll look at more development on it, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. So in essence, 7 is not a burning issue right now.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Well, and moreover, it doesn't connect with our affordability issue.
I don't think it does. I mean,
Well,
if somebody wanted to go up there and do multi-family housing on a septic site, I mean, it's not, there's plenty of it in the county.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, all these giant resorts are basically
Sure.
multi-family housing, very dense
Yeah,
on septic sites. So, can be done, but
yeah. But-
is that more likely
But-
than, I just think the scale you have to do that at in order to make it affordable is bigger than anybody's gonna wanna do here. So it's that 2 to 5 unit thing where we can try to squeeze them into existing, that I think is
Okay.
the bigger opportunity. Unclear where and what amount of vacant developable land exists with the access to utilities. So we have to have, again, this idea of our existing and future utility map. Well, I don't think we're gonna make a future utility map, but at least an existing utility map. And I actually think we already have this now.
I felt like
that
we
they
have that,
developed for
yeah.
us. Where is vacant parcels on existing utilities?
And to me, that goes, almost right up to the top when you talk about affordability, because it's the land that's already there, that's available on utilities. It might not be affordable, that, I mean, which is the problem.
Yeah.
Just because it's available.
Does this have to become a priority then? Is this one of these, chicken or egg before the chicken? I mean, and I know that you said, I feel like we've seen these maps and
Yeah.
we should is this just about information? Like,
I don't
people-
think the information is the problem. There's a lot of people that'll come in and say, show me a vacant lot because I need a house and I want to build one and I have the money and I just don't have any place to put it. And I could probably do that. Here's a dozen places you can put it, but they're not for sale. So there isn't any vacant lots connected to utilities in the city that are for sale. There's zero. That maybe they would be for sale if you made somebody an offer, but this isn't difficult research for someone to do. So I think this isn't a barrier. That's why I would put it lower on the list. And it's, we're not gonna have a future utilities location map. And if you really wanna know where these are, maybe we pick 3 or 4 that we've already talked to the EDA about with developers and just try to do some sort of information campaign about them as opportunities, but
Well, I think the one value to identifying these parcels, and especially parcels that might be publicly owned, is that you're not necessarily having to deal with market conditions. And, the city's ownership of the area inside the Gunflint Horseshoe, that presents an opportunity. Some of the land up in the below the business park across from law enforcement, it's on utilities, owned by the EDA. Certainly an opportunity there. It's,
Yeah. Those two, this piece of property and the Tom Tabota, and I'm not sure if there's really, and maybe the top of the business park triangle.
Yep, but there are a number of sites that are out there that should be identified as potential sites, because they have, I think, the greatest ability to be developed outside of market force, and, I mean, anybody else that owns a piece of property is gonna sell it for the maximum price they can get for it, whereas.
Indeed.
What's FLU map?
Future land use. So that's another thing that cities often do, and it's part of their comprehensive plan, is have a future land use map. Like, as we grow, this is how we anticipate zoning to look in the future. That hasn't been very relevant to our existence for a long time. We don't have one now. The implication is there will be utilities somewhere that there isn't right now for this future land use map. And I'm not sure that there's any use in us predicting that.
Right.
Number 9, unclear where future multifamily housing types are appropriate or desired. The comprehensive plan states, this is the crazy R1, R2 thing we got going on too. We've got R2, which has no multifamily housing in it, and it's harder to build multifamily housing in R2 than it is in R1 because the dimensional standards are more difficult.
Right.
All of our existing multifamily is in R1. Do we even want to say this is where we want multifamily housing? That's the question in my mind. I would just get rid of R2
Yeah.
right now.
Yep.
But then, that might be an easy change to just do. Everything that used to be R2 is now R1, ready to go. The more difficult conversation is, do we want to be prescriptive about where multifamily housing exists at all? That's the reason R2 was created, because the comprehensive plan said we want to put all of our multifamily housing in the same place and we want it to be on the east side of town.
I don't think we want to do that.
Well, this kind of relates to number 5, where we're dealing the same thing, we're saying the same thing about multifamily housing in that too, and.
Well, but even going back to 1, because once we start talking about the different types of housing that we want to have, I mean, much of that is multifamily.
Yeah, this one for me it's the same conversation
Yeah, it is.
that we're having right away.
Yeah, because.
Yeah, and I agree, it's 5. One of the rules of Is it only lot size and density and setbacks, or is it also distance from something, or do we not care at all? And I'm thinking we probably don't care at all, as long as you can meet the criteria that we would set by going through the conversation in 5.
Yeah.
Lastly, the current development standards in zoning and subdivision ordinance are outdated. Now, this one is a biggie, I think. And I would put it higher on the list if I was more excited about entering into this conversation. I don't think that subdivision is the answer to a lot of our housing goals. I think it's probably the most resource-intensive way to get at some of these things. But there's no doubt in my mind that our subdivision ordinance is not well-suited to the way that we're going to likely develop, and it's missing some pieces that we could really use if it starts to happen more often. So, update the subdivision ordinance to improve design standards for blocks, lots, streets, alleys, public spaces, stormwater management, and utilities. Yeah, we should do that someday. But maybe 10 is a good spot for that, because that's a tough conversation. I don't know how long the county went through this. Are they even really done going through it? I mean, they've got their ordinances in place.
40 years, I think they've been working on this.
Give me a quick example or briefing, or, I mean, I don't need a 40-year conversation, but tell me what's troubling about this.
Our subdivision ordinance does not have useful design standards for blocks and lots. I don't know if we even need them, but, so they've got some dimensional requirements in our ordinance, and they're not super relevant, and they're also different than our zoning ordinance dimensional requirements. So that's confusing,
Yep.
and it's a barrier. We don't have any design standards for streets. So for instance, Anton's development, that's gonna have a public street. We're gonna take ownership of it. And how we've dealt with the lack of standards, as we've said, our existing, at the time, city engineer is gonna have to be okay with whatever design requirements or design
So when we
details
talked
are in
about
there.
that, and we talked about snow removal and whatnot, okay.
Yeah.
And if he said he's cool with it, then we would have, okay.
And that's, again, now, that is unclear, and that means that there's some confusion up front, which adds risk and makes it more difficult for a developer to think about. It's also unclear to us what we need, so we get a development proposal back, and are we sure this is gonna work? Well, we don't really have any standards we've agreed to, so no. We don't talk about stormwater management in any useful way. We don't have a stormwater ordinance. We don't have design requirements for how much water they need to be able to handle or what they do with it. We've, again, tried to deal with that by keeping our engineer involved and making sure MPCA rules are followed, but if we were doing a lot of subdivisions, then we would definitely want to do this quicker.
We wouldn't be doing a lot of subdivisions because the developer couldn't get through the process. They'd just throw up their hands and say, this.
Not our process.
No. that'd be-
If we could hand them, here's the design guidelines, give this to your engineer, easy.
I mean, a lot of the regulations, I mean, the subdivision regulations were created prior to wetland regulations, stormwater regulations, and all those stuffs being incorporated as part of a development plan. Now, a developer has to deal with that, but they have to deal with it in the context of the dimensional standards and the lack of information that the city has with regard to design standards. So it's like the developers are operating in a vacuum, and they just don't know where the end of
A lot of barriers to
yeah,
this. I got it.
where the end of the obstacles or hurdles, happen.
And this is important and exciting, and I can see it, but why are you suggesting we keep it as a lower priority?
I don't think it's likely to happen a lot. Even if we make this easier, I don't know that there's as many opportunities to take a big chunk of land and build municipal utilities and subdivide it into a lot of small pieces. There's a handful of those places. And there's so much effort required in doing that, they're probably willing to go through the extra effort
Got
that
it.
we make them
Okay.
right now.
So for the 4 times that it might happen,
In the next 20 years,
okay.
yeah. It maybe if we make this clear, it happens a few times, and that'd be great. But there's things we can do that'll take less effort. It'll be easier for the community to figure out, and it'll create more results with some of the first conversations.
Okay.
So, hey, what do you think? This is it. We're at the
Oh,
end.
Easy,
Whoa.
easy now.
Are you happy with how the process went? Do you feel like we've got some usable stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it pointed back to things that we were kind of thinking about anywho's, but yeah.
Anything you'd do different now that we're at the back end of it?
I think it would have been interesting to have the sort of like the public meeting and bringing in interested people who are invested in all kinds of different ways, and have that meeting before you or with the consultant for the first time. Like, you should attend this. You should hear these needs as well. You know. And
As
just-
kind of a kickoff,
yeah.
rather than have the data collected and show it to them first.
Right.
Would you do both?
Well, I definitely liked that meeting. I definitely liked the idea of, looking at stuff. I think that leaving that meeting that night, just, the idea of like, let's just get rid of, these wacky R1s and R2s. Let's just make this open. Let's open this up. Let's try to make it accessible. And I mean, obviously the other thing is, the barriers. Where is it that we can do the most good? That felt like that was fairly clear. My curious, so what happens next? Like, who starts to, like if we start changing dimensions, who makes those decisions?
Well, you do. So what process will you use to help you do that is really what happens next.
I mean, I think going back to number 5, is going to be an important spot. I mean, like, I'm getting that sense of like, okay, if you're going to want to do, if you want to do an accessory dwelling unit, okay, here are the regulations or the standards that you apply to that. And if you want to do a tiny house, or if you want to do,
But isn't that getting back to 1? Why did you say 5?
And 3.
There's
And five.
there's a lot.
They're all
yeah,
so
yeah.
interrelated.
I mean, I think we almost have to take the whole concept of our residential zoning and really take and throw away the template we have in there now and start with these concepts and incorporate a regulation or an ordinance that starts to carry this
Message.
theme forward
Yeah.
rather than the focus of what was has been in the ordinance for the last 40 years.
So the strategy then that you might want to use, and there's a few different ways that we might go at this. We can actually just take some of these and make changes now and just do it. And then some of the harder questions like taking multifamily housing from conditional and making it permitted principal use, that we might need to think a little longer about what kind of rules do we want to have for that. Maybe we don't do that right away. Maybe we say the minimum lot size is now 7,500 square feet instead of 10,000. We don't have any width requirement or something like that. We could make a change that I think would be supported by the process we went through without having a lot of extra process with the community on stuff like that. But would you be comfortable? I mean, if we brought in a couple of proposals like that, and we can test out and find out if you're comfortable. and
Find
be
out
willing
if they're
to
comfortable, yeah.
be willing to move forward on it. The alternative is, like I said, we give Jeff a call and say, all right, we need some horsepower to help us do this work. Let's develop a proposal where you're going to help us write some new language and go through a community conversation about it and help the planning commission make some decisions. And we want to focus on 1, 3, and 5. So let's start with that. And we could talk to multiple firms if we wanted to, or just keep working with these folks. I think this went okay. I think it went pretty well.
I think if we wanted to keep it moving along, it would probably move along quicker if we asked somebody else to help us do that. If we do it ourselves, it's going to take multiple meetings and,
I mean, it'd take multiple meetings before we could even really bring you anything to think about at this point. With our own resources in-house, it's going to be slow, and that isn't a bad thing necessarily, but
Are we done with our work with this consulting group?
Yes, we're done with our work with this consulting
We've,
group.
the money that we've allocated for this has been expended and.
This is the final product that we asked for.
And we
that-
got it.
We asked for the maps that they created for us. We asked for the ideas that they brought to that meeting from other communities, what other places are doing. We
Yep.
asked for that meeting where we could have it with that group of people and
Yep.
talk about these ideas, and we asked for this report.
Great.
The implementation plan. So we got everything we wanted to get.
Okay.
Well, maybe,
So when you say that, you know, or when you imply that, if we want to keep, I mean, I agree that we want to keep some momentum going,
Yep.
and you state that we'll probably be more successful, we're working with somebody else, who are you implying?
well, I would go back to them, and, I mean, they're the ones that put this together, and, you know, I mean, ask, maybe get their advice in terms of, have they're familiar with other communities that have, you know, taken this kind of step, you know, I mean, looked at kind of readdressing their residential,
Okay? And I'm just curious, I mean, do
Yeah.
we have money to do that? We can do that?
We can afford it.
Okay.
Now, the planning commission doesn't get a budget, right? You don't have money to spend.
I
But-
would imagine we would.
But, no, wouldn't it be nice? I don't know.
Yeah.
But the community vision says housing's an issue. The council supported this all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next week, the council will hear a report, they'll see this,
Mhm.
and if what you want to do next requires some resources, that's when we'll ask.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that we
Yeah.
all have, see the connection between 1, 3, and 5. Seems like a logical starting place. It would be great to have, to work with the same group. They've already been invested in us, they know us. Seems like a slam dunk to me.
And I think they already have a vision of what they would do,
Great.
Right.
right? They thought about that while they were doing this.
Yeah.
So,
So will they,
Cool.
I'm thinking about these smaller like lot sizes and
Mhm.
you said we're at 10,000 and maybe go to 75 or maybe 5. I mean, how are we going to evaluate that? Are they going to say, well, if you do this, this is what it will look like, and if you do this, A, B,
Well, we
and
did
C
have that.
options, or?
We were kind of talking about that a little bit at the previous meeting, right? I mean, when we were looking at like what would be possible if we shrink or.
Yeah.
And we also looked at how many lots do we actually have in this size, and how many
Yeah.
lots do we actually
Yeah.
have in this side. And so there is some,
that's where I would go back to that map and say, all right, if we
But
make it
isn't that-
7,500,
this is what the map
this
looks like.
percentage, oh, I don't think we're gonna be able to even get that sophisticated.
Well, I'm just saying,
But
okay.
like this percentage of our properties could potentially have more houses than they used to have. This percentage that used to be substandard is now okay. And then where, you know, you're not gonna be able to, I don't think without putting a lot of resources in it, say, where are all the places houses are gonna get built
Right,
if we
right.
make this change? And so that anybody could drill down to their block and figure out what the change is. I don't think we can do that without a lot of resources. So then, can you make a change like that in a way that you're 100% comfortable? Well, I think there's gonna have to be some risk and unknown involved.
Yeah. But then, so, you know, we were saying 1, 3, and 5, and so I just want to make sure, but we're assuming, or I'm assuming from looking at this and reading these over, that 2 is going to get subsumed into 1, or it's, I mean, it's going to be part of that.
Yeah,
Whole
so let's
conversation,
go
right? We're
1,
not
2,
saying-
3, and 5. How about
And
that?
technically, in some sense, even though we look at
Well,
number
let's
4,
look at number
4
five.
will probably fall under the same classification of 5. Like if you're gonna identify different kinds of housing units and what they need.
Partly it
Part,
will.
but
The specific focus on mobile home parks is a separate conversation.
That's a
Yeah.
separate conversation,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we could kick that can. a
yeah, I
little,
mean, I think
but
just
not far.
this whole idea of all these other types of residential uses that are really kind of outside of our experience, you know, I mean, we talk about single-family homes and two-family homes, and that's about the extent of what we have, but all this other accessory dwelling units, corner houses, courtyard
have
cottage, I
those.
mean, that's like, what do we mean by all that stuff? I mean, we have to have a better
I understand,
understanding what
yeah.
all those things are and how they could work, and, I mean,
How we can use them,
right,
yeah.
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 And if there's something that we want, I mean, I don't think we know if we want all of those types of things, you know, because I don't think we know specifically what those mean, but.
So one of the things I'll ask them is, how do we get comfortable with that? And do they have any ideas? And I'll suggest to them, could we just pick 5 or 6 random places in town and say, okay, the rules are changed, let's see what this could look like? And how hard would that be?
That'd be, and just get some little
Maybe
models.
do a couple drawings.
Yeah.
I don't know whether they'd be like architectural, maybe just top-down drawings, but something like that.
Mhm. To get a sense of what that kind of density might look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love
That
it.
would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
You are
Well, all right.
charged.
I've got it. Thanks, everybody.
Let's make
Okay.
it so.
All right, so,
Thank you.
we are adjourned. Good meeting. I think it's very productive.